Welcome to Neon Cobra. Let's get into it. So we're going to be doing week 6 of our common estimates, and I'm actually going to take a slight pivot and talk about Azure Site Recovery instead. So I tend to get this question a lot, and it is a very deep topic, right? A lot of times we don't move forward with ASR because the value outcome is misunderstood, right? So what do I mean by that? A lot of organizations will be like, I cannot go down. I need to have hyper redundancy, whatever the case is. And then they come to a partner and a partner will come to me and we start to talk about it. What we find a lot of times is, the scope wasn't defined correctly with the client, right? We'll ask the client, well, what are we protecting from? It's like, well, what if I get ransomware? Well, site recovery is not going to fix that, right? Site recovery is going to replicate the infections. It's going to replicate the encrypted files, and you're going to fail over into the exact same scenario you're leaving from. So, okay. So usually that's where we talk about backups. Backups are your solution for this: proper EDR, proper remediation, standard operating practices, all that fun stuff. So ASR is not a solution for that. ASR is generally a solution for hardware failure or zone failures, right? Disasters. That's what we would generally look at. So then the next step I ask them is like, well, where are we failing from? If we're failing from, say, on-prem to Azure, ASR is fantastic, right? It deals with that hardware failure. If you're dealing with older pieces of equipment, you can strategize around that. But the Azure to Azure failures is a lesser action scenario. And we have to have conversations around what that looks like, right? You can fail from one zone to the other, right? Canada Central, Canada East, if desired. But then the question is, at this point, what are we trying to protect from, right? Are we talking about zone outages potentially from Microsoft? And I'm not going to say they don't happen, because earlier this week we had, some downtime in Canada Central. But the downtime was only an hour or two. And while that does seem like a lot, the amount of effort that has to go into a massive site failover, including the fail back procedure, may not necessarily outweigh the effort and the cost to run a site recovery. So what you want to account for really is, what is the break glass scenario? Define that first. What are we doing? What are we protecting from? I'm going to say in the 4 or 5 years I've been doing this with partners, I don't think we've deployed a single ASR, because as we start to dive down into the Azure, let me caveat on this, Azure to Azure ASR. Generally, when this occurs, there's other items in play here, right? It's not going to protect. They're not big enough to have this 5.9 availability requirements. Usually what we'll see the ASR is on-prem to cloud, right? Old infrastructure, want to try to stretch some life out of it. We'll build some architecture around that. So what I want to show today is how you can go about pricing. Now, this will work both in the on-prem and the site-to-site, or Azure to Azure rather. And I'll talk about some of the considerations. So all we're going to do when we hop over to the pricing calculator is we're going to take an existing quote I have. So let's say this Sage 300 one that I duplicated out, right? We're going to open this up. And the reason why I'm using this is because this is a good representation of an environment that has already been built out. Now, I'm going to go around and I'm going to choose, the Sage 50. I'm going to call this ASR demo, right? So Azure Site Recovery demo. Now, a lot of these items in this case, we have to take into account. So when you're looking at your Entra ID and your domain services, you actually need to create replications around this as well. So you can create secondary services and mirror those out. So it can be kind of difficult to size this, but for sake of pricing, I usually just duplicate this out as a second source. You create some site availability regions. There's a whole other article on what this looks like. So for sake of brevity and not overcomplicating things, we are just going to keep that item there for now. And we're going to assume that you've created some sort of resiliency or redundancy around the domain services. The more likely scenario is you're going to be on virtual machined hosted domain controllers. So what we're going to show you here for the virtual machines are going to make sense on this as well. So if I take the Sage 300, the first thing we're going to want to do is to get a proper ASR pricing, we're going to change the hours down to 0. Now, why would I do that? ASR has some requirements built into it, right? ASR has a cost per virtual machine being replicated, and then it has the cost for the disks being stored on the other side, right? You don't pay for any compute until you turn those systems on. So what I like to do is take a full virtual machine and then just mark the hours down to 0. This will take the licensing to 0. It will take the compute to 0, but will charge you or give you an idea what it takes to keep the lights on. So that's what we would do on this side. Same with the managed disks. We'll leave those the same. The Azure files will leave the same, right? The AVD will actually leave the same on this one. There's some considerations around AVD that we're going to talk about here as well. So drop that down to 0. I think we have total usage hours 0. We might actually have to scale that in just to see. Really what we're looking for is this and the data at rest. So let's talk about this. Azure Files is fantastic as far as its replication and its growth requirements, but it doesn't support geo redundancy on the premium SSDs, which means when you need to replicate over to another site, you can't just say, here's source A, here's source B. The general way to get around it is going to be to create a virtual machine on the other side running the Azure File Sync service. So it's actually synchronizing the files live, which means you are now running on the other end a virtual machine that is hosting the Azure File Sync. So that's how it's stutter stepping the data over. So you can see how you can go through some of these items here and rebuild on the other side, right? It gives you a good starting point. But so we'll do this demo 1 and we are going to save this. Let's say we're scoping this out from scratch, right? So let's do a demo 2. We are going to create Neon Cobra ASR demo 2. This is probably a way you would approach this, especially if you don't already have a pre-existing calculator. So same thing we're going to do. We'll come down, we'll edit to Canada. We will set our regions to Canada Central. Now, ASR is generally automatically paired with a sister region where applicable. Some fringe countries or fringe data centers may not have a sister pair, so it tries to find the closest one without breaking any geopolitical rules. For Canada Central, the replication will be Canada East, right? So we'll do a DC. We'll put it to 0 hours, right? We'll do a B2MS. We'll add our standard disk, and I'm just going to fly through this to get some numbers, right? We are then going to add app, right? 0 hours. We'll do a D4S. Doesn't particularly matter, but it's good to know as you modify through here, right? OS drives. We'll do a managed disk. Right? This will be a premium 128. We'll say this is a SQL server, right? So we'll call it SQL data, and then we'll do SQL logs. Okay. So we've got our starting stuff. Some additional items we'll need for this, right? So Azure Virtual Desktop is a great tool. Whether you maintain and keep a host pool online on the other side is completely up to you. If you're using things like Nerdio Manager for MSP, right, you could just have a geo-replicated golden image and you could build a fresh host pool on the other side. You could already have the host pool ready to go with no session hosts and then build the session host. It takes about 15, 20 minutes, right? So you can start that while you're going. Now, your profile disks, this is where you need to have a pre-run replication. So we can call this FS Logix replication. And then, we could do something pretty small for now. And then maybe during production hours, we'd spin it up. But the idea is this needs to stay on, right? We are replicating data at this point. And let's say we've got a terabyte of FS Logix. We'll call it replication. And this is going to be a premium SSD, right? So we'll say 1 terabyte to 1 terabyte. You will be replicating this using Azure File Sync services, right? This is something that exists in Azure Files. You can choose a target and then it'll replicate the Azure storage account acts as the authoritative source, and we're essentially enabling a cloud cache on this side. So your second host pool in this case would likely have a redirection or modified FS logic profile destination, but your user IDs should still replicate it, no problem. Right. Now, another point of note, if we're spinning up infrastructure on this side, you could always create a second domain controller and then just have them doing FS replication across. I like the idea of being able to fail over, mostly because we have to start dealing with networking, right? On this side, your network scopes will likely change slightly. There's going to be secondary IP addresses that need to be assigned to all of the network cards, but this is something you will generally flesh out as you're designing and as you're repping over. What we're really going to be looking at is kind of a pricing algorithm at this point and how to price things out. Now, other items. So this is going to be our domain controller, app server, our data, our FS Logics replication. We won't worry too much about the host pools, but we will maybe create like just a golden image disk, right? So just for sake of argument, we call this golden image, and it'll just be 128 gig, standard SSD. It's what we'll reference. And that can be managed through numerous ways, mentioning Nerdio Manager. So we are going to require potentially a traffic manager. So one of the things that often gets overlooked when we're doing Azure Site Recovery is how do you actually get to the information? You can fail over, you can get everything online, but then you realize your end users don't have, access to any of this stuff. The IP addresses are pointing to the old site because when you move in to the new region, you're not maintaining your public IP addresses. Those are located in that specific data center. So now, how do you route? So Traffic Manager allows you to do DNS routing. And then health point checks, right? So let's just say, for sake, 10 million DNS queries a month, right? Should be pretty low for most SMB, SMC. But then the Azure health check is what we want to be double checking. So let's say in this case, we've got, 3 virtual machines. We'll just round up to 5, keep it nice and low. And what this essentially is going to do is check the status of the systems that are in production. And when a site failover occurs, a true failover, not just I'm running a test, the health checks will fail, and then it'll go to the secondary zones that you have established, which in this case should be your ASR. So you don't have to update any sort of DNS records. You don't have to worry about that. Your traffic manager will be taking any publicly facing routes and updating those automatically for you. Now, for the session host, the AVD, you'll generally have a second session host in your Windows applications ready to be launched, right? So all your publicly facing things that you might have coming in via IP addresses will route to the new zone in Canada East in this case, but your host pools, you have to log in, do manually. So this is where we start to determine what's our recovery time objective, right? Failover usually can be within a couple of minutes, right? The traffic manager will flip over within a couple of minutes. The site replications, there could be a 15-minute delay on the FS logic profiles, but that's likely not to have a major impact, right? Because again, profile information a lot of times can just be replicated and fixed with OneDrive. So that should be a little bit better. But then we've got to figure out, okay, so how fast can it take to build our golden images and build our session hosts back up, right? On average, 20 minutes. But you have to start worrying about maybe capacity requirements. If you fail over into Canada East, maybe the types of VMs you were hoping to use aren't available at that time. So how do you pivot? So if you end up building a fully controlled host pool on that side and keep it completely powered down, you would want to add additional costs for some of the hard drives, right? About $25 per premium disk is what you'd be doing. That'd be allowing for a much faster spin up and replication, right? And at that point, you would cater to your golden image, make sure it's up to date. And then if you have to bring things up and online, you're not 6 months behind. So you're actually managing the other environment. It's not just a target. But that is high level, really. Actually, I apologize. There is one major component we are missing. And it's the actual Azure Site Recovery line item, because there is a cost just to have the tool online. So recovery to Azure, we've got two virtual machines is all we're really failing over at this point, our DCR and our app, right? The FS logic is being replicated, and that's with the cloud caching. So that's an always on feature. So all we have to do is protect the 2 instances at 68. So that is a fairly kind of drawn out a good idea of what your ASR buckets might be. The biggest takeaway from this one is you need to figure out how your networks are going to look, and then you need to establish process on how to access this, right? Build standard operating practices. You need to account for your data, because the more data you have on the source, you're paying for it on the destination, whether it's being used. Additional charges that often get overlooked. There is egress charges, right? The network, the zone to zone transfers, you pay for, right? Disk replication, storage transaction churns. Likely not to see too many in this, but if you've got high transactional databases that are not living on premium disks and those are hitting storage transactions, the replications on the other side will also hit the storage transactions. You can also set increased recovery points, right? So if you have higher recovery points in your ASR, that'll also start to adjust the price as well. That would really fall under the Azure backups line items with the amount of recoveries. It kind of all plays into that same. But these are areas where you may find additional costs added to this. So if you're going to price this out, you may want to buffer that a bit. You're going to want to wrap this with professional services and ongoing maintenance, right? Because this is not a set it and forget it product. You're probably going to want to run demo tests and things like that, because if they are expecting a recovery time objective, you need to be able to adhere to that, right? ASR is a really tough thing to nail as an MSP. A lot of it is really business focused conversations with your clients, because they need to understand that it's not a feature you just turn on and then you have immediate 5.9 redundancy, right? As environments get more complex, like this is easy. This is a domain controller, an app server, and then just access into it. When you start dealing with like highly available applications, maybe SQL database replication, and front web apps and things like that, that's where it starts to get really nuanced and is really almost a full-time consulting option. It should not be something you do as part of your service agreements, right? This is a custom build out. So a lot to kind of cover, a lot to consider. If I had to boil it down, ensure you're accounting for the Azure Site Recovery cost, ensure you're accounting for how to access it, what the networks look like, what sort of routing, like how does the on-prem connect to it as an example, if everything's running through a site to site and that site to site tunnel goes down in the source destination, do you have one in the other? Would you may want to add a VPN tunnel to this as part of the pricing, because even if it's not being used, you pay for it to have it online. It takes up to an hour to build a brand new VPN tunnel that'll cut into your RT or your RPO. Sorry, RTO. So again, we've got disks, we've got our networking, right? Ensuring profiles, replication of other features, those are accounted for as well. Add a little bit of padding for some bandwidth, maybe $5 to $10, not too much. So maybe it's just absorbed in the end. Those will be the four major things from a pricing standpoint. And then from an operational standpoint, determine your break glass scenarios ahead of time. You don't want to be in the middle of a fire having to be like, oh man, this is what we practiced for, and then realize it isn't, right? Ransomware being what triggered it, and suddenly you're doing all this extra work, right? Set your break glass, understand like when we have an outage, how long do we wait before we determine whether there's an ETA for repair or an ETR, or do we immediately action it the second it's down, right? What does that look like? Anyways, a little bit of a deeper, more hypothetical topic, right? I think a lot of this is more business level conversations, but if you do get down into it and start pricing it out, this is kind of some of the approaches you can go to this. Anyways, hope this was important and impactful. And if you have any other questions, let me know. As always, I'll post all this in the comment of the video. And with that, we'll catch you next time.